In the history of tabletop games, there have been 6 foundational forms that have existed for centuries: dice games, paper and pencil games, board games, card games, tile-based games, and miniature games. The origins of these classics remain shrouded in mystery, lost to the sands of time. However, in 1973, a significant evolution occurred in the small communities of the Midwest, in particular, Wisconsin and Minnesota.
Lake Geneva, Wisconsin in the 1970s was a once fashionable tourist town that had been down on its luck for 50 years.
I discovered that there were other people in the Twin Cities who had an interest in historical games.
This is a significant rivalry issue.
It began with the publication of Dungeons & Dragons, or D&D as it became known. The origins of D&D are a matter of spirited debate.
Gary laid down his Ironfoot will.
That drives the wedge in right there.
Which essentially meant that Arneson was out.
The reality, as we will soon see, is that it was a collective endeavor shaped by the collaborative efforts of individuals brought together by their shared passions.
The Twin Cities Gaming Group, pretty vibrant, very, very diverse group.
So whenever Saturdays rolled around and there was a meeting at Gary's, everybody used the basement doors so that we wouldn't have to track through the house.
We were largely gaming down the basement. Once or twice we had really big get-togethers where we sprawled our way up into the living room as well.
Sometimes we pushed it, a game during the week. Gary and I'd play a board game or a chess game or something like that. And then on the weekend we were playing, have all the people over, play a miniatures game or do something.
In the midst of the harsh Midwestern winters, young enthusiasts would gather to play games, continually refining and customizing rule sets.
And Dave Arneson, who also lived in St. Paul, probably 5 miles or 6 from where I lived.
He said, well, they don't carry the Milton Bradley games, but they had these interesting ones up on the shelf called Avalon Hill games. And that they were played locally by him and other people like Gary Gygax.
Arneson was a very friendly guy. I really enjoyed him. Gary was quite a talker. He could really spin a yarn.
Out of this niche hobby, visionaries like Gary Gygax, Dave Arneson, and Dave Wesley emerged.
He was a game designer himself.
One of the things that happens, Arneson goes from a, I'm the ref, you tell me and I decide plan into a, you get to roll the dice to decide it.
His enthusiasm was sort of infectious.
They harnessed their love for gaming, fused it with their historical knowledge, and kindled their storytelling enthusiasm, birthing the 7th form of tabletop gaming, role-playing.
I don't remember what happened in the first game, but I remember after the end of the first time I ever played, sort of staggering out of Gary's house going, I have no idea what that just was, but that was fantastic.
Fantasy is, because there's fewer physical limits, is much more wide open, and I think that's why fantasy became by far the most popular form of role-playing.
When Arneson moved into a fantasy world, he got an even bigger advantage.
There was this gut feeling amongst us all that this thing was huge.
So Gary was the man who launched it, really got it off the ground.
I can't remember who came up with the name for Dungeons and Dragons.
And they're opening the boxes. And here's the first edition of Dungeons and Dragons, the very first printing.
If Arneson was essential for that, he certainly was, but it would never have gotten past the weird thing that a small number of people in Minnesota do without Gary to take the big chance and publish it. That was enormous.
This is the tale of how Dungeons & Dragons came to life. I would say one of the most interesting starting points of the story is a man named Henry Bodenstadt. He ran a little hobby shop on the East Coast, and he also helped found a wargaming society called AHIX, or Avalon Hill International Kriegspiel Society. That's quite a mouthful. But so he was heavily involved in the wargaming community. He ran this hobby shop. He also imported some of his toys, and a particular line of toys that he imported were called elastilins. Elastilin were a set of small 40-millimeter plastic models that were highly detailed and painted, gorgeous looking, and bought right out of the box. A fantastic looking little miniature. He had to commit a lot of capital in order to import those. So what he did was he came up with this idea of creating a game around these figures that required you to buy the figures to play the game. There was a rule set called the Siege of Bodenberg. Siege of Bodenberg allowed you to use all of those miniatures, and Gary said, as soon as I saw that, I was completely enamored.
At this time, late 60s into the early 70s, when this whole gaming hobby and role-playing starting to gain momentum and traction and more interest and more titles and more people coming in and so on, was also a time of great cultural upheaval and political upheaval in America. The Vietnam War was going on and protests were reaching their height. And it was not a happy time with the 1968 assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. And it was a tough time, psychologically, as well as any young man had to worry about the draft and Vietnam and seeing friends go off to war, and then facing the personal question of, if you're drafted, what are you going to do?
Did I get a draft card? Oh, did I get a draft card? I was born on September 6th, and my lottery number was 6. So, and this was in 1971, and they were still drafting and sending people over.
This was in the early 70s. There was a lot of student unrest and turmoil and tribulation and all that stuff. I think I touched earlier upon the escapism of the hobby. This is what the kids were looking for, to escape.
So I think, in a way, the gaming hobby and the fun of that, against this rather bleak background, which stretched on for 5 to 10 years, arguably, and inflation kicking in and all that sort of thing, it was a good escape.
Lake Geneva, Wisconsin in the 1970s was a once fashionable tourist town that had been down on its luck for 50 years. There wasn't a whole lot going on. And if you didn't like, if you were a high school student and you didn't like sports and you didn't like drinking, there wasn't a whole lot to share in common with your classmates. And here's 8 or 10, mostly guys, but there were a couple of women even at the very beginning, who are interested in the same things you are and are willing to treat you as a peer.
Although this is a particular hobby where you can unleash a lot of creativity and entertain yourself and learn history or whatever happens to be, as well as have fun. So I think it was a beneficial counterpoint to everything that was happening in the world at that time.
Monopoly, not so much, but Risk, Diplomacy, Stratego, the miniatures war games, Avalon Hill board games, the 3M games. Playing games was our hobby, and there wasn't this strict type definition that these were acceptable games and the others weren't acceptable games.
I'd played chess before that and Monopoly, but nothing like what was going on down in that arena.
Back in 1965, I had, back in 1958, I got interested in wargaming, Avalon Hill boxed games. And then a couple of books about doing wargaming with miniature soldiers came out, and I thought, well, that's cool. You can kind of more latitude, you can have more your own stuff, invent your own scenarios and things. And so I got going on that. And even so, there were only me and 2 or 3 friends and a cousin who were doing any of this stuff.
I was interested in games. We played Parker Brothers and Milton Bradley games like most kids in America did in those days, and to a certain degree still do. And so I had an interest in board games, and an interest in history was developing as I grew a little older and got into junior high. And when I was in the 8th grade, I happened to be downtown St. Paul at St. Paul Book and Stationery store, primarily a bookstore with other items, and they had games. They had Avalon Hill games, this was 1963, 1964, and this was a whole new thing, board games on historical topics.
And a guy named Dan Nicholson came in from Montana, where he had been trying, just as I had, to induce friends to please play these stupid games with him. Well, he came in from Montana and joined the group.
Dan Nicholson was the oldest of the group, and I think I was the youngest.
Well, for the first 8 years, I grew up in a small farm town in northern Wisconsin. And then when I was 8, we moved down to Lake Geneva. And in 7th grade math class, I met Rob Kuntz.
I looked through the upstairs neighbors. They were a married couple, but pretty liberal during those days. He had a Playboy magazine. I was flipping through it, and that's where I saw the party gifts in the dogfight game by Milton Bradley. My brother and I had already played Battle Cry by them, which was a Civil War reenactment on a battle board.
Tim and I started playing war games, so we did the Avalon Hill, Big Red, and I forget the names even, but we played those games for quite a while.
Through this exploration of the hobby and learning about other gamers with this very specialized interest, I discovered that there were other people in the Twin Cities who had an interest in historical games.
I had been very much the major, most eager recruiter of gamers within the group at the time.
And foremost among those was Dave Wesley, who lived not very far, 2 miles from where I was living at the time.
I had gone to the libraries to try to find books on wargaming. I was dimly aware that it was actually a professional thing that armies did, as well as hobbyists. And I had found at the University of Minnesota a book called Strategos, the American Game of War. So I read it and I shook my head and said, way too complicated. Nobody's ever going to sit down and learn these rules. How can we ever play these games?
That's when we went down to the Five and Dime in Lake Geneva. And where I met Larry Zirk. He said, well, they don't carry the Milton Bradley games, but they had these interesting ones up on the shelf called Avalon Hill games. And that they were played locally by him and other people like Gary Gygax.
And a few years later, through Rob and another friend of mine, I met Gary and the rest of the Lake Geneva gaming group.
In the back of the book in those days, you would sign the book out and put your name on a card that was kept in the back, right? So it has the names of everybody who's checked the book out. And he figured anybody who's checked out in the last 4 years is probably still here. So there were 2 other people that were on that list. So he got the 2 of them into the group with us. And then each of them had a couple of friends. And so the group is slowly growing.
And Dave Arneson, who also lived in St. Paul, probably 5 miles or 6 from where I lived.
Tim somehow met Arneson's at some other convention or something.
They were very interested in history, and Dave Wesley had been in the U.S. Army and was a great student of tactics and history. And Dave Arneson, I believe, had a history degree in Napoleonic era history from the University of Minnesota.
I'd never heard anything of Arneson until Tim Kirkpatrick called me down to the basement. Tim drove, it turned out to be in my neighborhood. I had no idea what Arneson was about, that he even existed. And it's the same way with meeting Wesley, same way with meeting Nicholson, meeting all the people.
They very graciously welcomed us into their world of gaming, and that really expanded our horizons.
It was sort of a single journey in some ways. So I meet one person, I play with them, I meet another person, I play with them, and then I got to be part of the group.
I had gotten involved in wargaming and gaming in general through Len Lakofka. He was sitting next to me in a geography class back in the day in '68. And I was doodling, and he asked, would you do some drawings for for a magazine based on war games? I said, well, sure, why not?
And so I became the illustrator, and that's how I met Gary.
Well, as I noted, Larry Zirkin invited me over to his house. And then Larry called me on the phone, and we finally confirmed it. It was about a week or two later. I had gone up to another store he had recommended and picked up the game Africa Corps by Avalon Hill.
And about this point, Avalon Hill had The General, which was their in-house magazine. And in a period when it's very hard to find opponents, they'd have opponents wanted ads you could run in the back for free. You get 4 lines or something of space to put in who you were and how you could take on all the comers or whatever.
This was in the back of the Avalon Hill cover. If you ever saw the Avalon Hill General, they had advertisements for gamers wanted, opponents wanted.
That allowed me to learn about gamers outside of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I met Bill Hoyer in Milwaukee and Gary Gygax in Lake Geneva.
I took the bus. It took about 2.5 hours to get from Milwaukee to Lake Geneva. I got down to Lake Geneva. Gary was at the bus stop waiting for me, and we walked over to 330 Center Street, and I got the introduction of Gary and Mary and the kids, and that was that.
And so when I finally went over to Gary's, I walked in the door. It was 330 Center Street. They were setting him and Bill Hoyer were setting up the game Africa Corps. Well, I didn't think about it at the time. Obviously they're setting up because Larry Zirkis informed him that I bought the game. So there was a little bit they weren't going to teach me it. And I got excited when I saw it. I said, well, I have that game Africa Corpse. And Gary laughed and said, it's not a corpse yet,
Gary was quite a talker. He could really spin a yarn. And we started talking about board games, the Avalon Hill games.
And he was into board games. He was into miniatures. He really liked miniatures.
Listening to Gary talk about what he liked in gaming and what I liked in gaming, and back and forth for hours on end. And I don't think that I got to bed that night until about 2 a.m.
Gary was, first of all, he had a good sense of humor, and he always was happy with people, meeting people. He was very friendly. He was, for me, like a mentor in many ways.
Gary did something different for me. He was the first grown-up who treated me like an adult.
I was the youngest of that game group. I had to earn the respect of those people, because some of them, like Leon Tucker, when I complimented a tank on I think it was a Jagdpanther tank, and its paint job was camouflaged on the sand table downstairs, he berated me right in front of me and said, this little boy with his big tank. Leon Tucker was a professor of the old school, that kids probably didn't belong there. They needed to be somewhere else doing something else. I don't know. But it wasn't about a year I was beating them at their own games.
Dave Arneson had put an ad in because he and his friends in high school were looking for more guys. So he had him and the rest of his wargamer buddies there. And they were all a little younger than me, and they were all, as I recall, somewhat awed by the fact that I was a guy who, had a car, and I was what they wanted to be in just a couple of years soon, right?
I called one of them up, a fellow by the name of Dave Wesley, and he told me there was going to be a meeting of the general group, and I met Arneson there, and Dave and we started talking. We hit it off and had a great time talking about things. And from there, I went to, he invited me to one of their games. So then I went to see what they were doing, and they were doing Napoleonics.
So we brought them in, and they had friends. And then there would be another group would show up. So we're gradually accumulating these people.
Well, when I joined the group, yes, the infamous, I call it the Arneson basement crowd, but that's where the beginnings of the miniature playing and serious game playing.
So I had exposure to these other individuals who were, for the most part, several years older than I was. And that is what really drew me into what became the International Federation of Wargaming.
This is a significant rivalry issue.
In those days, as small as the gaming fraternity or community was, slowly growing, there was one major overarching fact, and that was that the Avalon Hill Game Company, which was the only publisher of games in those days, would release one game every spring. And that was an exciting time. You'd maybe get word of what it's going to be, and then it would come out usually in April or May, and that was it for another year. Hopefully you liked the title. If you didn't, too bad. You play the ones from the last few years.
So this club, which would ultimately become the IFW, was originally named the Continental Army Command. And so the Continental Army Command had this, a bit of a following, and they were starting to get interested in other war games. And it was actually Gary who, in one of the very early newsletters that they issued, coined the term International Federation of Wargaming. And by about 1970, have several hundred members.
So his idea was, why don't we, within this organization of the IFW, which probably had at least 500, maybe 1,000 members in those days, there's got to be a lot of people who love games, that have game ideas. Why don't we encourage them to produce their own games? So yes, there was an impetus to get the gamers themselves involved. Instead of just waiting for the annual release from Baltimore, from Avalon Hill, why don't we try to do this ourselves?
He got others to get involved, and if they had a design, he would talk it over with them and try to get them to write it down and how to do things.
He had heard that I had developed a game based on World War I aviation and aerial combat, and he encouraged me as a teenager to bring this game to the attention of the IFW and do a self-published version and see how that went over, and people could then offer comments, suggestions, critique for improvement and refinement. And so that's kind of how he encouraged me as a young man to get involved in game design.
He was in the game I was running, which was a World War II armor battle. And I'm sure that I probably made all kinds of mistakes, and I probably didn't know half of what I was doing.
He was just always around when people had questions about, what do you think about this? How do you do this? How do you do that? And Gary could always come up with an idea.
Yeah, but he was very encouraging about that, and he, in no way did he, put on the fact that, well, you're this college kid and you don't know what you're talking about. And he was put you at ease while you're doing it. So you didn't feel at all like, I'm being judged.
He was always encouraging me to do stuff and read things. So anybody who's encouraged he kind of took me under his wing.
He talked a lot of the gamers that we knew into running for positions in the IFW and getting them involved in producing games or writing games or variants.
When I first got in touch with Gary, he was still working at the insurance company, commuting every day from Lake Geneva down to Chicago. Gary was doing some independent designs and submitting them to companies, mainly historical subjects.
He was a game designer himself. He produced a number of games, not only for IFW, but for other magazines.
Back in those days, there were a lot of journals, hobby journals, and he would contribute. So he was known amongst other hobbyists as a contributor.
I became the editor of the International Wargamer. He was one of the major contributors, a very prolific writer.
He was prolific. He was a prolific writer, yes, and designer. He did, like I said, he designed some early games for companies.
He used to work at Fireman's Fund, and that was a 2.5-hour ride on the train from Lake Geneva. And in that time, he was able to do a lot of his reading and research. He was very thorough on researching whatever he was into. And also a lot of correspondence.
He corresponded with a lot of people in those days, and so correspondence was his best way. He had more time to write than he did to talk on the telephone, apparently. So we got to chatting by letter. Back in the days when you had to write a letter.
He definitely enjoyed writing articles for other magazines other than the IFW magazines. He wrote for Panzerfaust. He wrote for Don Lowry of Guidon Games.
I then went up to 330 Center Street and visited with him and saw what he was into, and big sand table there. I said, hey, you got to get into miniatures here with this kind of thing. You don't own cats, so the sand table has to be used for something.
Going from board games to miniatures opens up new horizons for any gamer. Using miniatures allows you to use a tabletop to fight out battles, where you've got miniature figurines, which can be different sizes. And of course, the Napoleonic era, which is what we focused on because that was Dave Arneson's interest and he ran a campaign, the uniforms are very brightly adorned from all the different principalities of Europe and the different countries and so on.
Eventually, however, two social crises came up. The one was that the really older guys, much older than us guys, really didn't want wargaming anyhow. And they eventually concluded that there were only a handful of us who really wanted to spend 9 hours painting the intricate details of the lace work on a Napoleonic uniform on a little lead figure.
People who are really into miniatures paint the figurines and array them on stands and make vast armies, which then what do? Well, the natural thing is you're going to play games with them.
Now, there was one significant barrier in those days, which was that they were old enough to drink and the teenagers weren't. And so if they wanted to get a little something to drink while they're having a war game, they could, but then they'd be running all sorts of potential problems with anybody there who told mom that they'd been drinking at the wargaming they were at. Boy, would they catch it after that, right? So they kind of marched off to their own drum and left us silly wargamers to ourselves. So in any case, the group then fragmented. And Arneson had been instrumental in bringing a bunch of the teenage crowd.
Arneson was a very friendly guy. I really enjoyed him. He, well, I don't know how else to say it. I mean, we had a good time. He loved to run things.
Dave was a great guy. He's a great gamer. He's very forthright, very fast thinker.
And so Dave Arneson was one of the, his folks had a basement he could use. That was a magnet. My folks had a basement we could use. Bill Hoyt's folks had a basement we could use. So there were certain people whose houses were where the gaming took place, and that gave you a certain a prestige or standing in the group. Arneson then, however, went beyond that in that he demonstrated great talents at running things.
His strong suit was design and actually conceptualizing things and thinking them through. So he had a design mind. He was a very quick thinker, all about having that the fun factor, but doing it, trying to nuance it in a way. Always trying to unhinge the linear and get rid of it. Let's see what we can do with it.
Dave had a kind of an edge to him. You know, like you'd say, well, I want to do that, and he said, oh yeah, you go ahead and do that if you want to. You know, you kind of got the impression there was something that was not going to be good for you.
We were largely gaming down the basement. Once or twice we had really big get-togethers where we sprawled our way up into the living room as well. But for the most part, Arneson's folks were upstairs doing it early up there, and we were down doing stuff in the basement.
The Twin Cities Gaming Group, pretty vibrant, very, very diverse group. You have people who are in college, people who are out of college, a few teenagers who were in high school, and that's how I started. And it was just a lot going on. People would have games on Saturday and, you know, want to come over and play. We're going to do this, that, or the other.
We'd go there almost every week. There'd be something going on at Dave's.
So whenever Saturdays rolled around and there was a meeting at Gary's, everybody used the basement doors so that we wouldn't have to track through the house.
Sometimes we pushed it, a game during the week. Gary and I'd play a board game or a chess game or something like that. And then on the weekend we were playing, you know, we'd have all the people over, play a miniatures game or do something.
And at that stage of life, we'd always adjourn to the basement for his various games he'd set up on the sand table, whatever. The concept today of the man cave really does come into concept here. In Gary's case, almost literal, a man cave in the basement. It was, the walls were rough. It looked like they were hewn out of the rock. I mean, not a finished basement at all. And they had access to the basement from a pair of side doors that opened up.
One of the games of that era, and by that I mean late 60s, early 70s, there was a board game called Diplomacy.
Diplomacy takes place pre-World War I and leads up to the declaration of war.
And it was basically a map of Europe. You could have anywhere from 3 to 7 nations, each represented by one player.
And each person who plays the game takes on the persona of a nation and plays up to 7 different countries, interest nations, as they lead up to the war and the diplomacy that is involved with that.
Each country would have fleets and armies, and you would order them move from province to province or ocean to ocean or parts of the Mediterranean Sea and that sort of thing, and try to displace your opposing armies or fleets, take their capitals, which were referred to as economic centers, and gain control of Europe.
And part of playing is that you want to convince people to do things, and you want the other countries to ally with you, and you want your enemies to be kept out of their supply chains.
From that large framework, Dave Arneson created the Napoleonic campaign kind of based on the same thing, and this is the highest level where you have fleets and armies and you move them.
But Tim needed a person to come and move his little lead soldiers around because he was the emperor of France, and he had the Grand Army, and he had 3 wings, and I had to be one of them. So, and that's how I ended up in David Arneson's basement.
Which probably had 20 or 25 players in at its peak, and he did that twice over a several-year period. And so we were very involved in that, and we got roles to play as part of that grand campaign, which was set around 1800 era, Age of Napoleon, and that sort of thing. So
I would only go there occasionally because of the way the battles worked in Napoleonics. We'd have these big strategic moves, and then on paper, and but then finally the 2 generals would commit.
It was originally a board game, but then it naturally fell into this, well, we could play this through the mail.
And David would grab these maps of Northern Europe that he found at the University of Minnesota and barrel down to the one spot and then actually create on the ping pong table. And he'd draw all these terrain marks, and then we would set up our little soldiers.
And I mean, this was down to single ship actions in some places, you know, where you're going to go attack a merchant fleet, and he would roll the dice to see how many merchant ships you captured, depending on how many frigates you had in a particular area and stuff. So pretty wild.
So Gary was a really prolific writer, and this postal diplomacy really became just an excellent tool for him to reach out to gamers all over the United States.
David was very good at maintaining enormous volumes of manually scribbled notes and records and spending endless hours in the library digging up details on how many rations do you use every day on a 74 gunship of the line, or whatever that would come up in the course of the campaigning.
And so what happens is players start injecting a little personality in there, and they start taking on the personas of the leaders of the country, and then they start sending these letters to the other leaders, and these are actually players typing it up as Kaiser Wilhelm, typing up these elaborate diplomatic letters, and then even coming up and making stamp designs and doing all of this sort of over-the-top immersion.
It's almost incomprehensible to believe all of the bookwork that was involved in an age when there were no computers. So if you're going to do something like this today, you could do it and you'd have computers and it would be still a major undertaking, but to think of doing that with index cards and sheets of paper and all of this reporting, which is certainly part of it, it's pretty amazing. And Dave brought it all together, and he was a great game master.
And so what this spawned was, it wasn't just one game. It started spawning all sorts of games. Somebody said, well, heck, if we can do this for World War I, we could do it for World War II.
There was a game called Indianomacy that he created based on the different Indian tribes in the United States, or in North America, if you wish. And it was based on diplomacy, which is a board game that involves wheeling and dealing and betraying and negotiating and bluster and all kinds of stuff like that.
Gary Gygax is very famous for creating Crusade-omacy, a medieval diplomacy game, or Khan-omacy, an Orient diplomacy There's also Conanomicy, which is based on Robert E. Howard's world of Conan the Barbarian.
Wesley would come up with all kinds of ideas, and he would feed them to Dave, and Dave would do the organization.
We were using David Wesley's Napoleonic rules that he had modified from a Civil War set by Totten.
You got these rules, and they would be full of mistakes and loopholes. And then you wind up in endless arguments about, well, the way I see it, there's a comma after that word, and therefore it must mean, rules lawyering is a big thing. So there are a lot of stresses within the group, and we get into a lot of games where it wouldn't end. We couldn't get it done by 2 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. It'd start on Saturday afternoon, and it would still be going.
And it would take hours and weekends to finish a battle, right? Because of the nature of how many pieces we were playing with and the personalities of the players.
Of course, one of the problems with these rules and the way they set up the campaign is these were commanders, and the commanders had to be there.
The Napoleonic.
Yeah, yes, and so we would spend a lot of dead time waiting for people to get there after work or get a ride there or whatever. Wesley was probably a little more fun at that time because Wesley is just a fountain of information, and he just goes on and on and on.
But in the midst of all this chaos, I thought back to Strategos, which I and 2 of the other guys had read, and said, there's some things in there that could be really helpful. Because Strategos said you were going to have a referee who ran the game, and he made all the calls on anything that was argued about. He could settle it, right? And I said, we may have to, I think it's the only way we're going to get these problems solved. We're going to have to establish that some guy is going to be the referee for the night, and he's not going to get to play, which is going to be a bummer. But on the other hand, having him just make sure that the game keeps going, that would be a big improvement. So we did that for a while, and indeed it worked really good.
Well, that referee, then Wesley came up with the idea. He says, well, we could do something like this and not just do the 2-second moves. We could actually do a situation.
So you have all of these wargamers injecting their personality into diplomacy, or the commanders on their battlefield, or some famous figure, or even some imaginary figure that they have for these various battles. And these things eventually lead to an interest in playing roles. And in the pedigree of Dungeons & Dragons, you can already see that there's a fair amount of role-playing.
Moving from strict historical gaming and board gaming into the Napoleonic campaign, where each of us is playing the role of the King of France, or in my case, the Pasha of the Barbary Coast, there's a role-playing element involved in that.
Gary understood this immersion was really key in creating a fun environment that supported itself.
Enough people had enough exposure to this sort of thing, and they enjoyed the role-playing because it's tremendously fun and it's very, very creative, that it was kind of a natural progression to move further into that. And as happened a few years later, it's no surprise, I think, that it really started to gain traction.
And so you'll see that later on when he goes into Dungeons & Dragons, and it's a natural step for him to take it, this diplomacy, role-playing immersion, and see the power of that as an entertainment tool, as a gaming tool, and just as a way of having fun. So Gen Con is a seminal part of the whole role-playing story because it tied a huge group of gamers together, but it started as a very small one-man operation. Basically, Gary invited a bunch of his friends to come over to his house in 1967 to get together to play games.
When we got together at Gary's house before Gen Con, the first Gen Con, and we must have had 10 or 12 people in his house at that time.
And they all thought it was fun, and he said, well, we should do this again next year.
I met Mike Carr there.
I met Gary through International Federation of Wargaming, and I knew of him, of course, through the Wargame Inventors Guild. He'd encouraged me to produce Fight in the Skies and see if that would catch on with other gamers.
Gary was a member of the IFW, and I became a member of the IFW because in those days you could enter Gen Con free if you were an IFW member.
The IFW tried to have their Malvern, PA IFW convention, and it didn't work out very well. Anyways, it was a financial disaster, and it really hurt the IFW, and it put them off of ever wanting to do one again. Well, Gary stepped in because he really believed in that networking and that connecting gamers together to bring all gamers from around the country, once again, to strengthen that gaming community. So he said, well, you know what, I can run this myself. You know, I'll take care of it all, and the cost at the door will cover the expenses.
And then when he had the idea of Gen Con, Geneva Convention based in Lake Geneva, in 1968, and invited IFW members to come for a day of gaming together, it was wonderful.
We were kind of anticipating it because there is going to be a convention in Lake Geneva, and there's going to be gamers down there. And so, oh yeah, we got to go down there and find out what's going on.
The first several Gen Cons were held at the Horticultural Hall in Lake Geneva, which was owned by the Flower Club. And at that time, I was 16, 17 years old, and asked my parents, could we possibly go to Lake Geneva so that I could attend this game day and they could do touristy things, because Lake Geneva is pretty well known as a tourist attraction.
When I first went down to Gen Con, being very optimistic, I took the train. And when I got off the train, it's like, okay, I knew his house was 330 Center Street, and that was all I knew. So I went over to his house, and because it had been, said in the previous year that people had stayed over at his house. And I figured, well, that sounds cool. I'll just, camp here. But he didn't really have the room.
And much to my delight and my eternal gratitude, they agreed to go to Lake Geneva, and they did touristy things for the day, and I attended Gen Con 1. Fortunately,
Lynn Lakovka and Bill Hoyer, who were in the IW, they had a hotel room. They said, there's others, you pitch in, you can stay. And it's like, sounds good.
And Gary Gygax had booked Horticultural Hall for the day, and that was, I think, August 24th of 1968.
So he runs and sets up his first Gen Con in 1968, all by himself.
It was just like heaven. I mean, it was marvelous to find all these people.
Previously to that, we'd mostly been in contact by mail, and we knew of each other and we knew we had a common interest, but to actually meet these people in person and be able to play games with them, enjoy camaraderie, and make a lot of new friendships, that's really very gratifying.
I mean, a lot of the people travel a great distance, and you didn't see them except at these games conventions and Gen Con.
And, we're going around looking, and the people had mimeographed sets of other rules, other games we could play. I mean, this was just great.
Well, some are playing Jutland, and some are playing Fitz, and, it was like, yeah, right, we've got all this going on.
I was excited as heck to find out, gee, these people have the board games that I had, like Tactics 2 and such, and there's people who want to play these games. It's like, great, they've heard of them, you're not the oddball.
And it was always exciting at conventions, but everyone came there for a specific reason. They all were playing their games and kibitzing about their games and stuff like that.
Of course, his children were there serving hot dogs, and I'm sure Mary Jo had some work to do there as well, but the whole Gygax family pitched in to make it happen.
He had me working in the concession stand with his daughter Elise.
I started working at Gen Con very young, and we used to always help out at the hot dog stand with John Bolbeck, and I could barely see over the counter.
The wonder that no one ever expired or got sick from that, I still to this day don't.
Local gamers like Bill Hoyer, Jeff Parent, they were all contributing factors to making it a success.
And that was a great time, and you'd see him and you'd carry and continue where you left off in your friendships and your relationships with people. And that was a great draw, and that was true also of Gary and his family.
He would have these gamers come from all over, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Indiana, Chicago, and they'd stay up and play games all night. and eating junk food. And we weren't allowed to have junk food, and so we were fascinated because they had sodas and candies, and but we had to they took over the house, and they'd stay all weekend, be sleeping on the floor in sleeping bags and the couple couches we had.
And just to meet all these other individuals who shared the same hobby and the same interest, be it historical or miniatures or whatever, was really a treat, really a delight.
And we'd get locked upstairs at a certain time of night, but we were excited because there'd be laughter and things going on until all the wee hours of the morning.
So Gary was really interested in a lot of different subjects at the time. And he was very interested in World War II armor. And they played Tractics by Mike Reese. But he didn't really touch on a medieval subject until he saw that castle and the whole Siege of Bodenberg being played out. And he even says that at one point during the convention, they were all pretending to sweep and clean up, while on the floor back behind everybody they were still playing games, and Siege of Bodenberg being one of them. And so it immediately caught his fancy. And this is what starts the ball rolling towards him being interested in a medieval subject, and especially a medieval miniature subject.
My girlfriend Debbie used to always go there, and my friend Erica. We had a blonde brunette and a redhead. And Erica had the idea to set up a booth and sell kisses, and I think we were 13 years old. And we just thought it was going to be too funny. And so there was a little card table, and we made these signs, and of course then we were going to give them a candy kiss. So we would say, "Come on, who wants to buy a kiss?" And my father was busy gaming, so he didn't know what was going on at the time. And then most of them were pretty good sports about it. There's only a couple of guys that came over because, let's face it, most of the guys were not interested in, well, we're teenage girls. There were some young guys there, but they're more interested in playing games. But I got reported to my father, and I got told I was improper behavior and had to take down my kissing booth signs.
The second year, I took the train down from St. Paul, took the Milwaukee Road Hiawatha to Chicago, stayed overnight with Bill Hoyer, and the next day we rode the commuter train with Gary Gygax. After he was done working at Fireman's Fund, we met him at the train station and rode up to Lake Geneva for the second Gen Con.
I first met Dave at a convention at Gen Con. I think it was Gen Con 2.
Dave Arneson. That goes back to one of the games conventions. Very pleasant person, very jovial. And he was very interested into naval wargaming.
Dave at that point was involved very much with Wesley's Stratego-Sen stuff, the Napoleonics.
Dave loved Napoleonics, and he especially loved the Age of Sail. And Gary had seen some of his work and had seen him demonstrate these games at Gen Cons.
So we go down there and we met Gygax and so on. And Arneson said, I'm going over to Gygax's house. You want to come along? So so I went there, and we were down in Gygax's basement talking about the kinds of war games you could fight.
My first impression of Dave was just as another gamer, because I had just joined the IFW, and I understood he was an IFW member as well.
And he designed a set of rules. Great, I'm going to have trouble remembering it. Don't give up the ship.
Don't Give Up the Ship is a Napoleonic-era naval battle game that you play with miniature figures, miniature ships, and you can create one-on-one frigate battles or fleet actions, depending whatever. It kind of came out of the Napoleonic campaign that Dave Arneson ran in St. Paul.
And I was working the concession stand with Elise. He was short on cash at that moment. I said, "Would you give us the article if for some hot dogs?" And he looked at me and all right. And so for 2 or 3 hot dogs, I don't remember exactly how many now, we got permission to publish Don't Give Up the Ship before it was officially published.
And eventually, through correspondence, Gary encourages him to publish his Don't Give Up the Ship rules, which is an Age of Sail miniatures rules set along with Mike Carr.
And then Gary Gygax was involved in that because we had part of this diplomacy going, which was all European, and Gary Gygax, being removed in Lake Geneva, 300 miles away, played the Americans, just as the American continent was far removed from Europe.
The important thing about this is that they accomplished this publication entirely by mail and phone calls. Gary often complained in his letters to Dave that we're going to have to keep our phone calls shorter and write more letters because of the increasing cost of the phone calls.
So he was involved in that, and then the rules kind of came out of that. So whenever we would have naval actions, we would use that set of rules, which evolved into Don't Give Up the Ship.
That's a very important point in the timeline of the Creation D&D because it gives them their first opportunity to collaborate professionally, and it gives Dave Arneson a professional publishing outlet that he can present his designs to. And ultimately, that would allow for the creation of Dungeons and Dragons.